never wanted to talk about this. It happened years ago, but I still can't shake the feeling that she's out there somewhere, waiting for me to let my guard down. Most nights, I can convince myself it's over. I go to bed, close my eyes, and pretend I'm normal. But there are other nights, the bad ones, when I can still see her standing there watching me from the trees. This all happened during a solo trip I took in the summer of 2018. I wasn't in a good place back then. Work was falling apart. My relationship had just ended, and I felt like I was choking on my own life. I needed space, time to breathe, so I rented a small cabin up in the northern woods of Michigan. The kind of place with no neighbors for miles, just trees and water and silence. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. The cabin sat right on the edge of a lake. Not big, maybe a few hundred yards across. The water was dark, surrounded by thick pine trees on all sides. There was a narrow dock stretching over the water, a small fire pit out front, and a single dirt road that led in and out. It was quiet, peaceful, exactly what I needed. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, made a fire, and sat by the water until the sun dipped behind the trees. The air smelled like pine and smoke. I remember feeling calm for the first time in months. I stayed up late reading and fell asleep with the windows open, letting the cool night air fill the room. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. I was out by the dock, drinking coffee and watching the water when I noticed her. She was standing on the opposite shore, right where the trees met the water. I could barely make her out at first, just a figure in the distance. She wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the lake. I thought maybe she was a hiker. It wasn't common to see people out there, but it wasn't impossible. I kept watching, waiting for her to move, but she didn't. She stood there for what must have been 10 minutes, perfectly still. I started to feel uneasy. I waved. Nothing. I called out, just a quick hello. Still nothing. After a while, I convinced myself it didn't matter. Maybe she was just standing there. Maybe she didn't hear me. I went back inside, but the whole day I couldn't shake the image of her standing there. So still it didn't seem natural. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept looking out the window toward the lake, half expecting to see her again. But the shore was empty. The water was still. Around midnight, I finally dozed off, and then the tapping started. It was soft at first, just a light, rhythmic tap coming from the front porch. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I held my breath, listening. It didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. Slow and steady, like someone lightly knocking with their knuckles. I checked the time. 2:12 a.m. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, a branch tapping against the porch. But I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. There was a weight to it. Something deliberate. I got up quietly, my hands shaking. I crept toward the window that faced the porch, moving slow enough that the floorboards wouldn't creak. I barely breathed. When I reached the window, I pulled back the curtain just an inch. She was standing on the porch. I felt my stomach drop. She was facing the door, her head tilted slightly to one side. She wasn't knocking with her hand. She was tapping with something thin. A stick, maybe. Slow and rhythmic, as if she had all the time in the world. I couldn't see her face clearly in the dark. Her hair was long and tangled, hanging over her shoulders. She wore a long, dark jacket that looked soaked through, like she had been standing in the rain. But there was no rain. I don't know how long I stood there, staring. My heart was pounding so hard I thought she would hear it. I wanted to move, to grab my phone, to do something, but I felt frozen, like if I moved, she would know. And then she stopped. She lowered the stick slowly, resting it against her leg. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing. Then she turned, stepped off the porch, and walked back toward the trees. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. She walked calmly, like she had all the time in the world. I stayed awake until the sun came up. I sat by the window, knife in my hand, staring at the tree-line. I wanted to believe it was over, that she was gone. But I knew better. I found the stick on the porch the next morning. It was thin and brittle, snapped in half where she had tapped it against the wood. That afternoon, I drove into town. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. I stocked up on food, locked every door and window, and told myself I was overreacting. That night, the tapping came back. This time, it was at the back door. I didn't get up. I sat there in the dark, holding the knife, my heart racing. The taps were softer this time, slower. I kept waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. It went on for hours, tap after tap, slow and steady. When the sun came up, I opened the back door. There were wet footprints leading from the trees to the door, bare feet. I packed my things and left that morning. I didn't even bother locking the cabin. I drove straight home, checking the rearview mirror the whole way. I kept expecting to see her walking down the road behind me. It's been years now. I haven't been back, but sometimes late at night I still hear it. That slow, steady tapping, and I wonder if she ever stopped. I don't talk about what happened at Ridgeway Lake. I've tried to forget it, to push it so far down that it becomes another one of those memories that lose shape over time. But this one won't fade. It sits in my chest like a weight. I've stopped trying to convince myself I imagined it. It happened, and if I'm being honest, I'm lucky to be alive. I rented the cabin because I needed a break. I know that sounds like the start of a cliche, some overworked guy looking for a weekend in the woods, but that's exactly what it was. My job was draining me. My relationships were strained. I felt like I was walking through my life on autopilot, numb to everything. I just wanted a few days to breathe, to clear my head. Ridgeway Lake is about 3 hours from where I live, tucked into the northern woods with nothing but trees for miles. The cabin was small, more like a hunting shack, no Wi-Fi, no cell service. I liked that about it. I didn't want distractions. I packed light, a couple of books, some food, a flashlight, and a hunting knife I'd barely ever used. I wasn't expecting to need it. The drive out was uneventful. 2 hours of highways, then an hour of winding back roads that twisted through the woods. By the time I got there, the sun was just starting to set. The cabin sat right at the edge of the lake, with a narrow dock stretching over the water. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where you could sit for hours and hear nothing but the wind. But even then, something felt off. It's hard to explain. It wasn't anything obvious. The place looked normal enough. Just a small wooden cabin with a tin roof, a fire pit out front, and a shed leaning slightly to one side. But there was this tension in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. I brushed it off. I was here to relax, not psych myself out. I spent the first evening by the lake, watching the sun dip below the trees. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like glass. I stayed out until the light faded, then went inside and built a fire in the wood stove. The warmth filled the room quickly. I made dinner, read for a while, and went to bed early. That night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft, deliberate knocks coming from the front door. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding harder than it should have. I checked my phone out of habit, but of course, there was no signal. I sat there listening. Nothing. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and crept to the window. I didn't turn on the lights. I just peeked out through the curtain. The porch was empty. The woods beyond it were dark and still. I stood there for a long time, waiting for something to move. Didn't. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the sound of the house settling or a branch hitting the roof. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the porch. I half expected to find something, footprints maybe, but there was nothing, just damp wood and a thin layer of pine needles. I made coffee, sat by the water for a while, and tried to forget about it, but the feeling stayed with me, that heavy, sinking feeling in my gut. I went for a hike that afternoon. The trail circled the lake and wound through the woods for a few miles before looping back. The air felt thick, heavy with humidity. As I walked, I kept hearing things, soft rustling, the snap of a branch, but every time I stopped to look, there was nothing. I told myself it was wildlife. I was in the woods. It was normal, but about 2 miles in, I found something strange. A campsite, or at least what was left of one. There was a tent, or what was left of it, collapsed in on itself, torn at the seams. A rusted camping stove lay half-buried in the dirt. Clothes were scattered everywhere, some torn, some soaked through with rain. It looked like it had been abandoned for weeks. And the strange thing was, there were no bags, no food, no personal belongings, just the tent and the clothes. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. My first thought was that someone had packed up and left in a hurry. But why leave everything behind? I didn't stay long. I made my way back to the cabin, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped to listen, the woods went silent. No wind, no birds, just nothing. I locked the doors that night, bolted the windows. I kept the fire burning, more for comfort than warmth. I sat in the armchair by the window, staring out at the woods. And then, just past midnight, the knocking started again. 3 slow, heavy knocks. I froze. My hands were shaking. I stared at the front door, heart pounding. Felt different this time, more deliberate, like someone knew I was awake. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen. My palms were slick with sweat. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside. There was someone standing by the tree-line. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out their face, but I could see the shape of them, tall, standing perfectly still, facing the cabin. I stared for what felt like forever, waiting for them to move. They didn't. I sat there for hours, watching. By the time the sun came up, they were gone. I packed my bags that morning. I didn't care if I had another night booked. I threw everything in the car and drove down the dirt road, checking the rearview mirror the whole way. I kept expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me, but I didn't. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the mud on my back bumper, a single handprint smeared across the metal. I called the property owner to ask about the campsite I found. They told me no one had rented the cabin in months. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't camp. I don't even drive through the woods if I can help it, because sometimes at night, I still hear the knocking, and I wonder if they ever really left. I always thought of myself as careful, not paranoid, just practical. I lock my doors, double-check the stove before bed, and keep a flashlight by the nightstand. You do those things because the world is unpredictable. People are unpredictable. That's what I told myself. I thought it would keep me safe. But out there in the woods, none of it mattered. I booked the cabin because I wanted space. Real space. Not just a weekend trip to the mountains where you're bumping into other hikers on every trail. I needed to be far from people. It had been a long year. Too many late nights at work. Too many calls I didn't want to answer. My head felt crowded all the time. So when I found a listing for a remote cabin in Black Hollow, I didn't think twice. It wasn't fancy. Just a 1-story cabin with a tin roof, a wood stove, and a small bedroom. The listing warned that there was no cell service and no internet. Perfect. I packed enough food for 4 days, filled the gas tank, and left early on a Thursday morning. The drive took longer than I expected. The first few hours were fine, highways, small towns, the usual. But once I hit the last stretch, the road narrowed to a single dirt path cutting through thick forest. It felt like I had crossed into another world. No houses, no signs, no power lines. Just trees as far as I could see. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was sinking low behind the hills. The place looked older than I expected. The wood was dark with age, the porch sagged slightly under its own weight, and the windows were streaked with dirt. Still, it felt sturdy enough. I parked the car, grabbed my bag, and went inside. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Real silence, not just quiet, but the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you shouldn't make a sound. I could hear my own breathing, the creak of the floorboards under my boots. I dropped my bag in the corner, lit the wood stove, and sat down on the couch. I felt calm, but that feeling didn't last. That first night, I barely slept. It wasn't because of a noise. It was because there wasn't any. Not a single sound. No wind. No crickets. Not even the distant crack of branches. Just complete, unnatural stillness. I lay there with my eyes open for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling like something was off. I couldn't explain why. The next day, I went for a hike. I followed a trail that looped around a small lake about a mile from the cabin. The air was cold and damp, the kind of cold that sticks to your clothes. I didn't see another person. I liked that at first. It was what I wanted, to be alone. But about halfway around the lake, I noticed something strange. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud on the edge of the trail. Bare feet. No shoes. Big enough to be a man's. They led down toward the water and disappeared at the edge of the lake. I stood there for a while, staring at them. Something about it didn't feel right. I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe someone had been swimming. Maybe it was nothing. But when I turned around to head back to the cabin, my chest felt tight. That night, the noises started. It was past midnight when I heard it. A soft rustling outside the bedroom window. I froze, heart pounding. At first, I thought it was an animal. A raccoon, maybe. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded deliberate. Slow, heavy footsteps. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound moved from the side of the house to the porch. Slow, steady steps. The wood creaked under the weight. I checked the time, 2:13 a.m. I felt like my heart was trying to punch its way out of my chest. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat there listening. The footsteps stopped at the door. Then, slowly, the doorknob rattled. I felt cold all over. My hands were shaking. I waited, barely breathing. It rattled again. Not fast, just a slow, quiet testing. Then it stopped. I waited until the sun came up before I opened the door. There was nothing there. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. But something was wrong. I could feel it. The woods felt heavier, the kind of silence that presses down on you. The third night was worse. I sat in the living room with the lights off, the wood stove burning low. I didn't want to sleep. I was too wired, my mind racing with every possible explanation. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that I was tired, that being out there alone was messing with my head. But around 1:30 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, not running, not stumbling. Slow, steady steps circling the cabin. I turned off the stove and grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen. I didn't turn it on. I just waited. The steps stopped by the back door. I could hear breathing. Not heavy, just slow, calm breathing. The kind you make when you're trying to be quiet. I stood there with the flashlight in my hand, muscles tense, waiting for something to happen. But it never did. It just stayed there, standing, breathing, for almost an hour. And then it left. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my bags. I was done. I didn't care if I had another night booked. I threw my stuff in the car, started the engine, and backed down the dirt road. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. I didn't see anyone, but when I got to the main road, I stopped to check the tires. There was something stuck to the back bumper. It was a single, bare footprint, pressed into the mud. I drove straight home. I never called the owner. I never left a review. I just left. And now, even months later, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't leave it behind. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the slow creak of footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if it followed me home. I always thought I was the kind of person who could handle being alone. I told myself I liked it. There's something about the quiet, the space to think, the calm of it, that always made me feel in control. But I learned the hard way that there's a difference between being alone and being isolated. And when things go wrong in the middle of nowhere, the silence isn't peaceful. It's a reminder that no one is coming to help. I rented the cabin because I needed to get away. That sounds like a cliche, but it was the truth. Life had been heavy for a long time, the kind of weight that creeps up on you until one day you wake up and realize you're tired of everything. I thought a weekend by myself, away from the noise, would clear my head. The cabin was small and simple, tucked deep in the woods about 2 hours from the nearest town. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, and just enough power for the lights and the fridge. That was the appeal. I didn't want distractions. Just trees, the sound of the wind, and maybe a good book. I got there late on a Friday afternoon. The drive-in was rough, a narrow dirt road that wound through miles of thick forest. The trees pressed in close, branches hanging low enough to scrape the roof of my car. I didn't see another car the whole way. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was starting to set. It looked just like the pictures. A small, weathered building with a sagging porch and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. There was a shed out back, half collapsed under its own weight, and an old fire pit surrounded by rusted folding chairs. It wasn't much, but I wasn't expecting much. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled faintly of wood smoke and mildew. There was one main room with a small kitchen off to the side, a wood stove in the corner, and a single bedroom down the hall. It felt empty in a way I couldn't quite explain, not just quiet, but hollow. I shrugged it off. I wasn't here to be comfortable. The first few hours were calm. I unpacked, stacked some firewood by the stove, and made dinner. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The woods were completely still, no wind, no birds, just silence. I should have found it peaceful, but it felt heavy. I went to bed early that night. I was more tired than I realized, and the drive had worn me out. I locked the doors, left the fire burning low in the stove, and crawled under the thin blankets. I fell asleep fast. I woke up to a noise. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, just a faint sound, soft and distant. I lay there for a while, listening. Came again. A thud, quiet but deliberate, not the kind of noise a house makes when it settles. I sat up slowly, my heart already pounding. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the fire through the cracked bedroom door. I listened, barely breathing. Another thud. This time, it sounded like it came from outside. Something heavy hitting wood. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer knocking into the porch. But it felt intentional, steady, like someone testing the walls. I got up, heart pounding harder now. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and made my way to the front window. I kept the lights off, not wanting to give myself away. I peered through the glass. Nothing. The porch was empty. The trees beyond it stood still. I stayed there for a while, waiting, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. A branch falling, maybe. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to forget about it. I went for a hike, followed a narrow trail down to the river, sat on the rocks for a while just listening to the water. It helped, at least for a bit. I told myself I was being paranoid. Being out here alone was getting to me. But when I got back to the cabin, something was wrong. The woodpile by the back door, the one I'd stacked neatly the day before, was scattered across the ground. Not just knocked over, scattered like someone had kicked it. The firewood lay in the dirt, half buried under leaves. I felt that knot in my stomach again. I looked around the clearing, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The woods were too quiet. I cleaned it up, telling myself it didn't matter. Maybe an animal. Maybe I hadn't stacked it as well as I thought. I went inside, locked the doors, and started the fire early. I wanted to feel warm, safe. But that night, the noise came back. Started around midnight. The same thud, heavy, deliberate, came from the back of the cabin this time. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. Another thud, then another. Slow, steady. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window. My hands were shaking, my breath shallow. I peered through the glass, scanning the clearing. Nothing. Then I saw it. A figure low to the ground, moving just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't walking. It was crawling, shoulders hunched, limbs long. It moved slow, circling. I only caught glimpses between the trees, but it was enough. This wasn't an animal. I backed away from the window, heart hammering. I grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter and sat by the stove, the fire throwing shadows against the walls. The noises kept going, soft thuds, the scrape of something against the wood. I sat there until dawn, gripping the knife so hard my hand cramped. When the sun finally came up, I went outside. I found more than tracks. There were marks on the walls, long scratches low to the ground. The back door had a dent in it, as if something had been ramming against it, testing it. I looked at the tracks in the dirt. They weren't animal prints. They were footprints. Bare, white. I packed my bag that morning. I wanted to leave, but when I got to my car, I found the tires slashed. Deep cuts, straight through the rubber. I didn't even hear it happen. I tried to walk out, but after a few miles, I realized I was being followed. I never saw who it was. I only heard the footsteps, slow and heavy, always just out of sight. I never made it back to the cabin. I never looked back, and sometimes, even now, I still hear the thud. Slow, deliberate, like it's still out there, waiting. I didn't come to the mountains to be scared. I came to clear my head. After the divorce, after selling the house, after everything fell apart, I just wanted a break. A week away from people, away from emails and texts and all the questions I didn't want to answer. The cabin in Black Pine was the perfect place for that. Quiet, cheap, out of the way. A single dirt road leading to it, surrounded by miles of forest. I was expecting cold nights, long hikes, maybe some wildlife if I got lucky. I wasn't expecting whatever that thing was. I got there on a Friday afternoon, right as the sun was dipping low behind the mountains. The drive had been long and slow, the last few miles winding through thick trees that looked like they had been there for 100 years. The cabin itself wasn't much, just a simple, one-story place with a wood stove, a kitchen, and a small bedroom. It was old but sturdy, the kind of place hunters probably used in the off-season. I dropped my bag in the living room and took a walk before it got dark. The woods were calm, the ground soft under my boots, and the air smelled like pine and damp leaves. I followed a narrow trail down to a creek about half a mile from the cabin. The water was low, just a trickle running over smooth stones. That's when I noticed the tracks. They were in the mud near the edge of the water, big, deep impressions with long claw marks at the tips. My first thought was a bear. I'd seen tracks before while hiking, but these were different. Longer, narrower, like a dog's paw, only twice the size. I knelt down, running my fingers over the edges. Fresh. I stood up and looked around, but the woods were quiet. No movement, no sounds, just the wind in the trees. I took a breath, shaking off the feeling creeping up my spine, and started back to the cabin. The first night was calm. I made a fire in the stove, cooked dinner, and sat on the porch with a beer. The stars were bright overhead, clearer than I'd seen in years. I stayed out there until the cold started to bite, then headed inside and locked the door. I slept fine. The second night, that was when things started to go wrong. I'd spent the day hiking, following the creek deeper into the woods. I didn't see anyone else out there, no other cabins, no cars on the road. It felt like I was the only person for miles. It was peaceful, until I found the second set of tracks. They were bigger this time, deeper, the same shape, long, narrow paw prints with claws that dug deep into the dirt. But they weren't near the water. They were in the middle of the trail, and there were more of them, a lot more, like something had been pacing back and forth, circling. I followed the tracks for a while, my pulse picking up with every step. They led off the trail and into the woods, disappearing into the brush. I didn't follow them. I turned back toward the cabin. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I sat by the fire for a while, trying to read, but I kept glancing at the windows. The trees outside were dark, barely visible in the moonlight. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement, a shadow between the trees, something low and fast. But when I looked again, it was gone. I told myself it was just my nerves. Being alone in the woods can do that. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. A howl, low, deep, and close. Too close. It echoed through the trees, rising and falling in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't a wolf. I've heard wolves before. This was different, bigger. I got up slowly, locking the front door, checking the windows. I turned off the lights and sat there in the dark, listening. It howled again, closer. Then I heard something else, movement. Slow, heavy footsteps moving through the trees. I walked to the window, heart pounding, and looked out. For a second, I thought I saw it. Something tall moving between the trees. bigger than a person but hunched low. Broad shoulders, long arms. It moved fast, too fast for something that size. I backed away from the window, my chest tight. I grabbed the hunting rifle from the wall. I wasn't even sure if it was loaded. My hands were shaking as I checked the chamber. It was 5 rounds. I sat there for hours listening. The footsteps circled the cabin. I heard claws scratching at the porch, slow and deliberate. I kept the rifle pointed at the door, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then, just before dawn, silence. I barely slept. When the sun came up, I walked outside. My breath caught in my chest. The ground around the cabin was torn up. Deep claw marks in the dirt, long grooves down the side of the porch. There were prints everywhere, circling, pacing. Whatever it was, it had been there for hours. I packed my bag that morning. I wanted to leave, but when I got to my car, I found the tires shredded. Deep gashes in the rubber, like something with claws had raked them down to the metal. I was stuck. That night was worse. The howling started as soon as the sun went down. Closer this time, louder. The footsteps circled the cabin again, heavy enough to shake the floor. I could hear it breathing outside the windows. Deep, slow breaths. I stayed low, rifle in hand, barely breathing. Then I heard it on the porch. The boards groaned under its weight. Claws clicked against the wood. It stopped in front of the door. I stared at the doorknob, praying it wouldn't turn. And then it slammed against the door. The whole cabin shook. I stumbled back, aiming the rifle at the door. It slammed again, harder. The wood splintered. The hinges groaned. I fired through the door. Once, twice. The sound was deafening. Silence. I waited, heart pounding. I could hear something breathing, heavy and wet. Then footsteps, slow, fading into the woods. When the sun came up, I grabbed what I could carry and left on foot. I didn't look back. I walked until I reached the main road and flagged down the first car I saw. I never went back to the cabin. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that howl. Low, deep, and too close. And I wonder if it followed me home. I never liked being out in the woods alone. Not because I was scared, not exactly. I just didn't trust it. There's something about being that far from people, where the trees press in close, where the wind makes sounds that could be anything. I guess it makes you realize how small you really are, how far you are from help if something goes wrong. But I needed this trip. After the year I'd had, a breakup, losing my job, and a bunch of other little things that built up like pressure in a pipe. I wanted to get away from everything. Just a weekend by myself. No distractions, no noise. I found a cabin listed on some backwoods rental site. The kind of place that barely had a description. No cell service with stove, outdoor pump for water. Old school. Felt right. Took me half a day to get there. The road turned from pavement to gravel to dirt, then finally to nothing but tire tracks through the trees. The further I drove, the more I felt like I was leaving the world behind. My car bounced and rattled over potholes, the trees crowding in so close that branches tapped the roof. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was hanging low over the trees. The place was smaller than I expected. Just 4 walls, a roof, and a narrow porch with a few old chairs stacked in the corner. The wood was dark with age, the windows cloudy with grime. I sat in the car for a minute, engine running, just staring at it. Felt too quiet, but I shook it off. It was just a cabin. I grabbed my bag, turned off the car, and headed inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The kitchen was tiny. A sink, a propane stove, and a fridge that buzzed when I plugged it in. There was a single bedroom, just a bed with a thin mattress and a wooden dresser with one missing drawer. The bathroom wasn't much better. I didn't mind. I wasn't here for comfort. I spent the first hour unpacking, getting a fire going in the wood stove. It was a cool night, the kind of cold that sneaks in through the floorboards. I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sun sink below the trees. That's when I noticed the marks. They were on the porch railing. Faint scratches, like something with claws had dragged them across the wood. Not deep, but long. I ran my hand over them, feeling the rough edges. Could have been anything. Raccoon, maybe a stray dog. I shrugged it off. But when I walked around to the back of the cabin, I found more of them. They were lower this time, near the base of the back door. Longer, deeper, like whatever made them had been trying to get inside. I knelt down, running my fingers over the grooves. They were fresh. The wood was still pale where it had been scratched away. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I told myself it didn't matter. Some animal, nothing to worry about. I went back inside, locked the doors, and made something to eat. I sat by the stove, the room warm and quiet, trying to push it out of my head. But that night, I couldn't sleep. It was the sound that woke me, a faint tapping against the side of the cabin. I opened my eyes, staring up at the dark ceiling. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it kept going, steady, rhythmic, like something tapping on the wood. I sat up slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I listened for a long time, holding my breath. It stopped. I told myself it was a branch, the wind knocking it against the cabin. I rolled over, pulled the blanket tighter, and tried to sleep. I barely got 2 hours. The next day, I went for a hike to clear my head. There was a trail that wound down to a small creek about a mile from the cabin. The woods were thick and quiet, the ground soft with fallen leaves. I tried to focus on the calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I found the footprints about halfway down the trail. They were faint, just impressions in the mud, half filled with water. But they were big, too big for any animal I could think of. Not boots either, bare feet. The shape was wrong, wider. I crouched down, tracing the edges with my finger. It wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. The mud was still soft. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. I walked back to the cabin faster than I meant to. That night, the tapping came back. Louder this time, harder. I sat up in bed, clutching the knife I kept next to my bag. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. And then I heard footsteps. They were slow, heavy, moving in a circle around the cabin. I sat there for hours, waiting for something to happen, for the door to open, for a window to break. But it never did. The footsteps kept going until just before dawn. Then they stopped. When I checked outside in the morning, I found more scratches on the back door. Deeper this time, longer. I wanted to leave. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and started down the road. But a few miles out, I found a tree blocking the way. A thick pine, uprooted and lying across the road. There were no storms, no wind, nothing that could have knocked it down. I tried moving it, but it was too heavy. I tried going around, but the woods were too thick. I was stuck. I drove back to the cabin, hoping there was another way out. That night was the worst. The tapping started at sunset, louder than ever. Not just one spot, all around the cabin. It moved from the walls to the windows to the roof. I locked the doors, sat in the corner with my knife, and waited. The footsteps came next, slow, heavy, circling the cabin. I could feel the floor vibrate with each step. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but no animal walks like that. The power went out around midnight. The lights flickered once, then went dark. I sat in the dark for hours, listening to the footsteps. They never stopped. When dawn finally came, I grabbed my bag and ran. I left the car, left everything, and hiked through the woods until I found the road. I walked for miles until I finally reached a house with a phone. I never went back for my car. A week later, I checked the rental site. The cabin was gone, no listing, no contact info. Like it had never been there. But I know it was. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps, still feel the floor vibrate under my feet. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it. I wasn't looking for isolation. It just kind of happened. I had taken a week off work, mostly because my boss told me I needed to. Something about burnout, mental health, all the usual buzzwords. I didn't argue. I was exhausted. I spent the first couple of days lying on my couch, scrolling through my phone, not really doing anything. By the third day, I realized I couldn't spend the whole week cooped up in my apartment. I needed space. I found the cabin online. It wasn't exactly a vacation rental, more like a hunting cabin that someone listed on a website. Cooper's Hollow. It was in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, 2 hours from the nearest town, down a dirt road that barely existed on Google Maps. I figured it was perfect. No cell service, no emails, no people. Just me, a few good books, and some peace and quiet. I packed light, some clothes, food, a flashlight, and a hunting knife my dad gave me years ago. I wasn't expecting to need it, but it felt good to have. I threw it in my bag, fueled up my car, and left early in the morning. The drive was easy enough at first, highways, gas stations, the usual stuff. But after a few hours, the road started to change. The pavement cracked, then turned to gravel, then to dirt. Trees closed in on both sides, thick with bare branches that tangled together overhead. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was hanging low in the sky. The place looked rougher than the photos, smaller too. The wood was dark and weathered, the windows cloudy with dirt. There was a small porch out front with a single rocking chair. It creaked as the wind moved it back and forth. I stared at it for a second, feeling uneasy. The key was in a metal box under the porch. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like wood smoke and mildew. The cabin was one big room. A bed pushed against the far wall, a wood stove in the corner, a tiny kitchen with a sink that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a bathroom too, but it was just a toilet and a rusty shower. I dropped my bag and walked around, checking the windows, testing the locks. Everything seemed fine, quiet, almost too quiet. I figured I was just adjusting to the silence. No city noise, no cars in the distance. I kept telling myself that. I spent the rest of the evening settling in. I started a fire in the stove, made dinner, and sat on the porch for a while, watching the sun go down. The woods stretched out in every direction, thick and dark, with no sign of anyone for miles. It was peaceful in a way I wasn't used to, but as the light faded, the woods started to feel different. The air got colder. The trees seemed closer. I kept hearing noises, faint cracks, rustling leaves. Normal stuff, I guess, but when you're alone, it doesn't feel normal. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep. I left the fire burning low in the stove, just enough to keep the room warm. I must have dozed off for a couple of hours, but something woke me up. It was a sound, faint but sharp, a branch snapping. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The room was dark except for the soft glow from the stove. I held my breath, listening. Another crack, closer this time. Not fast, not frantic, slow. Like someone was moving through the woods, step by step. I got out of bed quietly, grabbing my flashlight. I didn't turn it on. I just stood there in the dark, waiting. Another noise, not a branch this time. A thud, something hitting the ground. I walked to the window, staying low. I pulled the curtain back an inch and looked out. The moon was bright enough to light up the clearing. I scanned the trees, waiting for my eyes to adjust. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, watching. Eventually, I went back to bed. I didn't sleep much. The next day, I went for a walk to clear my head. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that wound through the woods. I followed it for about a mile, the air cold and still. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. About a mile in, I found something strange. A pile of stones stacked neatly in a circle, no bigger than a dinner plate. It looked deliberate, like someone had placed them there carefully. I knelt down, brushing my fingers over the stones. They were cold, damp from the morning air. Felt wrong. I don't know why, it just did. I kept walking, but I found another pile a few hundred yards down the trail. Same size, same shape, perfectly stacked. That same uneasy feeling crept up my spine. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was starting to set. I locked the door, shut the curtains, and sat by the fire. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I kept hearing things, faint noises from the woods, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. They were slow, heavy, not running, just walking, circling the cabin. I sat there, heart pounding, clutching the knife in my lap. I kept telling myself it was an animal, a deer, maybe a bear. But deep down, I knew better. I turned off the lights and sat by the window watching. I waited for hours, but I never saw anyone. The footsteps kept going until just before dawn. Then silence. The next morning, I packed my bag and left. I didn't care about the rest of my trip. I just wanted to get out. As I loaded my car, I noticed something on the porch. Another pile of stones, just like the ones in the woods. I never saw who made them. I never saw anyone at all. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those slow, steady footsteps in my head, and I wonder if it was someone, or something worse, someone who never left those woods. I booked the cabin on a whim. It was late October, and the weather was starting to turn. The kind of cold that sinks into the ground, creeping up through the soles of your shoes. I remember standing outside my apartment one night, feeling the cold air bite at my face, and realizing I needed to get away. Not forever, just a few days. I wanted quiet. No people, no cars, no emails stacking up in my inbox. Just silence. I found the place online. Ridgeway Trail, deep in the backwoods of northern Pennsylvania. It wasn't fancy. A one-bedroom cabin with a wood stove and a narrow porch. The photos on the listing were grainy and dark, probably taken with an old phone. There was nothing cozy about it. The furniture looked old, the walls were bare wood, and the fridge was one of those loud, clunky ones with a metal latch on the door. But that was what I liked about it. Felt real. I was tired of polished, Instagram-ready vacations. I wanted something rough around the edges. The directions the owner sent me were simple. Follow the main road until the pavement ends. Then keep going another 5 miles. It didn't even have an address, just a marker on a map and a vague description of the mailbox at the turnoff. I left early in the morning, packed light, and drove north with the radio off. The last few miles were the worst. The road narrowed until there was barely enough room for my car. Trees pressed in from both sides, their branches scraping the roof like fingernails. The ground was soft from rain, and my tires slipped more than once. I almost turned around, but I was too stubborn. I kept telling myself it would be worth it once I got there. When I finally reached the cabin, it was nearly dusk. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything in muted shades of gray and orange. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by trees so tall they blocked most of the light. The porch sagged in the middle, and the windows were small and grimy. It looked older than I expected, like no one had been there in years. I parked my car near the edge of the clearing and got out. The air smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke, though there was no smoke coming from the chimney. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. The lock was stiff, but it clicked after a few tries. Inside, it was cold, the kind of cold that sits in the walls. The wood stove was in the corner, rusted but functional. The furniture was rough. A small table with 2 mismatched chairs, a sagging couch with faded cushions, and a bed in the next room that looked like it hadn't been slept in for years. I dropped my bag on the floor and stood there for a moment, just listening. Nothing. No cars. No voices. No birds. Just the wind moving through the trees. I should have felt calm, but I didn't. There was something off about the quiet. Felt too thick, like the woods were holding their breath. I told myself it was just my nerves. A long drive, bad weather, nothing to worry about. I unpacked, lit a fire in the stove, and made something to eat. By the time I finished dinner, it was fully dark. The kind of dark you don't get in the city. No streetlights, no headlights, just the moon hanging low and pale through the trees. I sat on the couch with a blanket over my lap, watching the fire crackle in the stove. That's when I heard it. A single crack, sharp and sudden, from somewhere outside, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing. No follow-up noise, no movement, just the sound of the wind. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. I went to bed a little while later, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to every little sound. The creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the trees outside. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I sat up, staring at the door. I stayed like that for almost an hour, but nothing happened. The next morning, I felt stupid. I made coffee, walked around the clearing, and checked the porch. No footprints. No signs that anyone had been there. I chalked it up to nerves and decided to go for a hike. There was a trail behind the cabin that led down to a stream. It was narrow, overgrown in some places, but easy enough to follow. The woods were thick and quiet, the trees packed tight together. I walked for about a mile before I noticed something strange. A piece of clothing hanging from one of the branches. It was a jacket, faded green, torn at the sleeve, hanging too high to have been left there by accident. I stopped and stared at it for a long time. The longer I looked, the less sense it made. There were no other signs of people, no campsites, no trash. Just that one jacket. I left it there and kept walking. I didn't get far. A little ways down the trail, I found another piece of clothing. A boot this time, mud-caked, lying on its side. No footprints around it. No path leading in or out. It was just there. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first. Something sour, organic. I followed it off the trail, pushing through the trees until I reached a small clearing. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The ground was dark and wet. The smell was stronger here, thick enough to make me gag. I crouched down, and that's when I saw the bones. Small bones. Animal, I think. Clean, white, piled in a loose circle. The dirt around them was packed down, like something heavy had been sitting there for a long time. I felt this cold knot form in my stomach. I stood up and backed away slowly, every instinct in my body telling me to leave. I walked back to the cabin faster than I intended. By the time I got there, the sun was already low. I locked the door, shut the windows, and sat by the wood stove, staring at the flames. I couldn't stop thinking about the bones, about the jacket, about the boot. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard the noise again, the same sharp crack of a branch breaking. Then footsteps, slow, heavy, moving in circles around the cabin. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew better. I sat there for hours, listening as the footsteps circled the cabin over and over. They never came to the door. The next morning, I packed my stuff and left without looking back. I never found out who or what was out there. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those slow, heavy footsteps, about the bones in the dirt, about the jacket hanging too high in the trees, and I wonder if it was watching me the whole time. I rented the cabin because I needed time to think. That's the honest truth. I wasn't running away from anything dramatic. No messy breakup, no midlife crisis. I was just tired. Tired in the way that sinks into your bones. Work had been a grind for years, and it felt like I was living the same day on repeat. Wake up, commute, sit in a gray office, come home too exhausted to do anything, fall asleep, and start over. I was burned out. I found the place online. Black Hollow was what they called it. Some rundown, single-bedroom cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would go for a vacation, but that's what I liked about it. It looked rough. No Wi-Fi, no TV, barely any phone signal. The pictures showed a sagging porch, peeling paint, a wood stove in the corner. Felt real. I figured a few days there would clear my head. The drive out took me longer than I thought. The roads got worse the deeper I went, turning from cracked pavement to gravel to dirt. The last few miles were nothing but narrow, winding paths with trees pressed in close on both sides. I barely saw any other cars the whole way. It was just me and the woods. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The place looked exactly like the photos, maybe worse. The wood was dark with age and weathered from years of storms. The windows were small and cloudy, and the porch sagged like it was ready to collapse. But I didn't mind. I wasn't there for comfort. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and walked inside. The door stuck a little when I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The inside smelled like wood smoke and old dirt. It was small. A single room with a bed, a wood stove, a little kitchen, and a bathroom tucked into the corner. Basic, quiet. I unpacked slowly, listening to the woods outside. I expected to hear birds or insects or something, but it was dead silent. Maybe that was normal this time of year. I didn't know. I wasn't much of an outdoors person. After I put my stuff away, I went for a walk to stretch my legs. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that wound down toward a creek. I followed it for about a mile, just taking my time. The trees were tall and dark, branches twisting overhead and blocking most of the light. The ground was soft with damp leaves, and the air smelled earthy and cold. Felt heavy. I don't know how else to describe it. Like the woods were pressing in on me. I kept walking anyway, telling myself I was just imagining it. When I finally reached the creek, I stood there for a while, listening to the water. At least that was a normal sound, steady and calm. I felt better for a moment, but as I turned to head back, I noticed something. On the opposite bank, just past the trees, there was something hanging from one of the branches. I squinted, trying to make it out. It looked like fabric, a strip of something faded and torn, too high up to have gotten there by accident. I thought about crossing the water to check it out, but something stopped me. I had that prickling feeling on the back of my neck, the kind you get when someone's watching you. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone. I turned and walked back to the cabin. That night, I built a fire in the wood stove and ate a can of soup. The warmth helped shake the cold out of my bones, but I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about that strip of fabric. Maybe it was nothing, a piece of an old tent or a jacket that got caught. But the longer I sat there, the more it bugged me. I went to bed around midnight. The mattress was thin, and the sheets smelled a little musty, but I was too tired to care. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and closed my eyes. I must have slept for a couple of hours before something woke me up. It was a noise, faint, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. A snapping branch. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark except for the dying embers in the stove. I listened, holding my breath. Another crack, closer this time. Not an animal. I know what animals sound like. This was heavier, slower. Footsteps. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my socks barely making a sound on the wooden floor. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. The moon was out now, casting pale light across the clearing. I scanned the tree line, waiting for my eyes to adjust. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows. But then, near the edge of the woods, something moved, a shape tall and thin. It wasn't walking toward the cabin. It was standing still, facing me. I stared for a long time, my chest tight. My mind kept trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a tree. Maybe I was half asleep and seeing things. I blinked. It didn't move. I backed away from the window, heart pounding. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I wasn't surprised. I thought about turning on the porch light, but something in me said not to. I didn't want to let it know I'd seen it. I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the phone like it was a weapon. I stayed like that for hours, barely breathing. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep sitting up because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The sunlight felt too bright, like it didn't belong there. I went outside, my legs stiff. The grass was wet with dew. I walked to the spot where I thought I'd seen it, half expecting to find nothing. But the ground was disturbed, pressed down in long, heavy tracks. Not shoes, not boots, bare feet. I didn't stay long after that. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and left. I kept looking in the rearview mirror all the way down the dirt road. I never saw anything. I still think about it, though. I tell myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, my mind playing games. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I catch myself listening for the sound of footsteps, and I wonder if it's still standing there, watching,